Middle-earth is more than just land. It is the memory of ancient heroes and the terrors that awoke with the first light of dawn today. An old wizard will tell you yet. Another legend, so you may understand that even the darkest times can give birth to light. Long after the fall of Barad and the vanquishing of Sauron, when peace had settled over most of Middle-earth the hush of a summer dusk, a quiet dread stirred far to the east beyond the greenwood and past the sea of ruin in the wild lands where maps faded and tales grew uncertain. Old whispers returned, tales of a black wind rising from forgotten tombs and of riders glimpsed by moonlight cloaked in shadow. It began in the eastern reaches of Gondor, where the land grows dry and thorned before giving way to the desolate borderlands. There in a garrison of stones, set upon a lonely hill, a young captain named Halion stood gazing into the distance. He was tall and grim, born of a proud line, and still bore the memory of war in his dreams, yet now in days of uneasy peace. He served under quieter banners, keeping watch, chasing raiders, and protecting Lonely Road. Lately those scouts had vanished. 3 riders had ridden east toward the dead hills, tracking a caravan that never returned. None had come back. Ravens sent with messages never flew home. And then the dreams began. Pelion had seen them, great black gates swinging open to a windless night, a pale crown broken in the dust, and most of all a voice cold and old and hollow as a tomb, whispering in a tongue not heard since. The world was young that night, as stars kindled above the plain. Halion was summoned to the command hall, where an aged steward named Thronon awaited him. Thronon's beard was silvered, and his eyes bore the weight of many winters. He unfolded a map on the table before them, pressing a weathered finger to a blotch near the sea of ruin. There, he said quietly, that is where they were last seen, the Vale of Dusk. Do you know what once stood there? Halion shook his head. Nor should you, Theron murmured, but in the days before Sauron, before the rings were 9, it was a kingdom of men proud, rich and cruel. The one they called the Third Nazgûl was its king. When he fell under the power of the ring, he cursed his own tomb, so none might steal his secrets. He paused, voice low, but the curse was never lifted, and now something stirs again. Pion frowned. You believe he's returned? No, said the Rin. Worse, I believe he never left. So Halon rode, leading a company of 12 across the windswept plains. They passed into lands unmarked by road or stone, into grasslands that whispered and shifted as if murmuring secrets. Crows followed them. The wind grew still. As days passed, they reached the edges of the Vale of Dusk. The air was colder there. The grass turned gray, and strange shapes stood in the distance, ruins of black stone leaning like broken teeth. One night, while camped near a dry stream bed, a watchman vanished. No cry, no sound, only a single boot left by the fire. The men grew uneasy. Then came the storm. It rose from the east with unnatural speed, veiling the moon and stars. Rain did not fall, but the wind howled like wolves at the gate. Halion and his men held their torches high as shadows crept among the rocks. One by one the lights flickered out, swallowed by the night. Form ranks. Halion shouted, drawing his sword, but something unseen struck him from behind. He fell, his head cracking hard against stone. When he awoke, the world was silent. The Fire was cold as men were gone. Only one figure stood nearby, a woman cloaked in ash grey, her eyes like the desert sky. Before dawn, she knelt beside him, speaking in a tongue he barely understood. Do not rise too quickly, Captain, she said now in Western. The wraiths hunt still. Who are you? Halion gasped, forcing himself upright. I am called Era, she said, and you are. The last of your company. Halil stared around in the camp. Was ruin tense. Torn gear, scattered blood, marking the earth. No bodies, no sign of struggle, only absence. They are gone. She said, her voice low, taken by the servants of the one who lingers beneath the stone. The curse is upon you now, as well. Halin felt a chill touch his spine. What curse the third? She said with the weight of old memory. He who was once king, who called himself Azul, the Undying. He broke the oath of the kings of men and turned to black sorcery even before Sauron's ring found his hand. He sealed his soul to this land, and it rots still beneath it. She reached into her cloak and drew forth a stone black and smooth as night, carved with a broken crown. This was found upon one of his barrows, she said. It is a key or a curse, depending on who wields it. Helene took the stone. It pulsed cold in his hand. I must finish this, he said, standing at last. Whatever this curse is, I will see it ended. Velva met his eyes. Then you must go where no light has touched in 1,000 years. You must enter the vault of the third Nazgûl, and you must not listen when he speaks. Above them the sky groaned with thunder, though no clouds moved. A shadow passed across the moon, and so their journey began. The morning after the storm was colorless and cold, as if the world itself held its breath. Mist clung low over the veil of dusk, curling around the rocks like pale fingers. Halion tightened the strap of his sword belt and stepped carefully through the remains of the camp. Every torn scrap of cloth, every half-buried footprint was a cruel echo of the men who had stood by him just days before. 12 had ridden east with him. None remained but him. Valera moved silently at his side, light-footed and watchful. She had the manner of one used traveling alone, and though her clothes were worn and rough, her bearing was proud, and her gaze sharp. She carried no sword, but a curved knife hung at her hip, and she wore a strange band of copper across her brow, etched with old runic symbols. They crossed a shallow ridge and descended into the wide valley beyond. The land there was scattered with jagged stones and half-buried ruins, foundations of forgotten towers and halls built by men whose names no longer lingered in even the oldest songs. Halion kept his hand close to his blade, but they met no living thing, not a deer, not a bird, not even a buzzing fly. The land was silent as a tomb. This place was once called Damarin, Valera said at length, her voice quiet but steady in the tongue of the East. It means throne of shadows. Here the third Nazgûl ruled before he fell under the power of the ring. He built his palace with stone drawn from the deep earth and moored with blood. No song was ever sung here that did not end in death. High looked around. A low wind stirred dust across the crumbling stones. You speak as though you've walked here before. I have, she replied, pausing by a cracked pillar that rose out of the ground like a jagged fawn. My father was one of the desert guardians when I was a girl. We came to bury our dead beyond the hills. The elders forbade us to set foot in the vale, but I came anyway. I heard the voices, then soft and bitter like echoes in old stone. The longer I stayed, The more they whispered, what did they say? Bell glanced at him. They asked me to. Listen as they pressed on the ruin, grew deeper, stranger, stone bridges spanned. Empty chasms, towers half swallowed by earth leaned at impossible angles here. And their blackened statues peered from behind broken archways, tall hooded. Shapes with no faces, arms folded in silence. Some had crumbled into dust. Others seemed untouched by time, but all bore the same symbol, a broken crown. Ringed with fire, they came at last to a wide stair of black marble, mostly buried. In the ground, only the top few steps showed, each carved with runes that shimmered faintly under the mist. Van knelt and brushed moss away, revealing a sigil. Halion recognized a symbol once drawn on the black banners. Of Mordor a hand, wreathed in smoke. This is it, she said, the gate to the vault. Call felt the stone from the barrow shift slightly in his pocket. He drew it out. It pulsed in his palm again, cold and faintly glowing as he approached the stair. The rooms on the steps grew brighter, lighting with a sickly green hue. The mist around them grew heavier, thicker, until it choked the air. A groaning sound echoed from deep below, stone on stone, like the sigh of some ancient beast. The stairway was opening. Are you certain this is the only way? Halion asked, eyeing the dark below. There must be other means. Belarash shook her head. There are no other paths. The relic you carry has awakened the vault. The nasal spirit is bound within, sealed by his own enchantment. Only one who bears the stone may enter. Halion studied the darkness. It yawned beneath them, deep and hollow, as though the stair descended forever. He forced himself to step forward. The air grew colder as he passed below the threshold. His torch flickered, casting long, shivering shadows on the walls. The passage turned from marble to a strange green veined stone that drank. The light symbols etched deep into the rock pulsed faintly, not with heat, but a kind of living memory, like the walls were watching. Valor followed close behind. And the moment she crossed into the vault, a loud clang echoed behind them. Halion spun around. The stair above had vanished, swallowed into smooth stone. There is no going back, Valera whispered. They pressed deeper. At first the path was narrow and twisted, barely wide, enough for a man to walk without brushing both shoulders against the walls. But as they descended, the way opened into a vast hall lined with dark columns. At the far end stood a disapon, which rested a stone throne, and upon the throne a shadow sat. It was not flesh, it was not bone, it was form without form, cloaked in night. Two pale eyes gleamed in the darkness, and a voice, low, slow, ancient, filled the chamber. And so the blood of Elendil dares walk my path. Alien froze, sword half-drawn. Valora reached for his arm, gripping it hard. Do not answer, she hissed. Do not let him into your thoughts. But the voice laughed, and the sound was like a chime of cracked bells. You carry my mark, boy. You heard my call. You came to your own will. I know what you seek. I know what you fear. The air grew thick. Halion felt his memories tugged forward. The screams of dying men, the fire of Minas Tirith, the cold still face of his brother lying in a healer's tent. You want power, the voice purred. You want to be more than a watchman on the edge of a fading world. You want your name to be sung. No, Halion said, though the word caught in his throat. I came to end you. The shadow rose from the throne bend. Try the chamber shuddered. Dust fell from the Sealing from the floor around the throne shapes emerged wraith-like creatures clad. In ancient mail their eyes hollow swords rusted, but still sharp 9 of them, and each bore the broken crown upon their brow. Balera drew her knife, and took a step back. We must run. Now Halen did not. Argued together, they turned and fled down a side corridor as the creatures gave. Chased the path, twisted, and fell away beneath their feet. Down they ran, stumbling through webs and bones deeper into the vault's heart, the voice of the third Nazgûl echoing behind them. There is no escape. It whispered, you carry my curse, you are already mine, and far below. Something stirred in the earth, the corridor twisted like a coiled serpent, falling deeper into the earth slick with damp and crawling with moss. The further they ran, the more the stone around them seemed to close, and not merely narrowing, but breathing, swelling, and shrinking. With each heartbeat, as if the vault were alive, Halion felt the sting of sweat in his eyes and the weight of the darkness pressing down on his shoulders. The stone from the barrow pulsed faster in his pocket, its cold seep crawling along his skin. Behind them came the clatter of boots, if they were boots, and the sickening hiss of things long dead, given false breath. Valera moved like a spirit ahead of him, her cloak trailing smoke in the faint green light of the rooms that lit there. Way she glanced back once, her face pale and taut with urgency, and led him down a side passage that dipped, suddenly sloping toward a distant glow. They won't follow if we reach the sanctum, she said, her voice breathless but steady. There Master cannot leave the throne. Not fully. Halen did not ask how she knew the time, for questions had passed. They burst at last into a chamber unlike the others. It was shaped like a circle, wide and low, and in its center rose a black stone archway. No door, no wall behind it, just an empty frame carved with a broken crown sigil. In a silver pool at its base around the room stood 7 statues of cloaked men, each facing inward, each bearing a sword pointing down. Though time had worn their features smooth, their presence was unmistakable. These were kings. Valera dropped to her knees beside the pool and drew from her satchel a bundle of folded cloth bound in wax twine. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal a second relic smaller than Halon's stone, but cut from the same dark crystal. It shimmered with a soft inner light, and as she held it to the pool, the surface of the water rippled and cleared, revealing not their reflections, but a vision of a barren plain beneath a blood-red sky. This is the Eye of Narrations, she said. One of the last relics of the runic priesthood. It sees what memory still lingers. Look, Aelia knelt beside her, peering into the water. At first the vision swirled like smoke in a stirred cauldron, but slowly it settled. He saw a man in robes of crimson and gold standing atop a black altar. Before him knelt warriors armored in bone and bronze, chanting in a deep rhythmic pulse, and on the altar was a crown, a twisted thing of black iron set, with bloodstones crackling with shadow. The roadman lifted it high, and when he placed it upon his brow, his eyes turned to fire. That is Hazel, Valera murmured. Before the ring, before the Nazgûl, he was a sorcerer king long before he became a servant of Sauron. He bound himself to the land with a curse so that even if he died, his soul would remain. He believed it would grant him eternal kingship. Halion pulled back, shaken by the vision. He knew death was coming. It welcomed it, she said bitterly. so long as his name was never forgotten, eh? Low tremor stirred the room. Dust fell from the ceiling and one of the statues groaned faintly as though stirred in sleep. The pool's light dimmed. We have little time, Villa said, wrapping the eye once more the relic you carry. His barest stone anchors part of his soul, but it is only one piece there is. Another deeper, still hidden in his burial chamber, that is the root of his power. We must reach it and destroy it. Elliot nodded, drawing his sword again. The blade shivered in the strange light, and he noticed faint runes along the steel's edge, his family's crest, and below at the words their annal. Noticed that before. Barrera crossed to one of the statues and pressed her hand to its basest section of the wall slit. Open with a grinding sigh, revealing a narrow stair leading downward carved of black stone. From below drifted a faint rhythmic sound like a slow heartbeat. Echoing through a deep cavern, they descended in silence. The air grew colder, still heavy with the smell of dust and long dead things at the bottom. They stepped into a long hall lined with sarcophagi. Each bore the image of a man in repose, hands crossed over a chest, face serene in death. But the eyes had been scratched out on everyone at the far end. Stood a great tomb, taller than the rest, and carved from obsidian upon its lid was a relief of Alzul himself, crowned and smiling faintly, as though mocking all who dared disturb him. At the base of the tomb was a narrow channel filled with water that glowed faintly. Blue runes lined the channel's edge, old and cracked, but still humming with power. This is it, Valera said, voice low, his true grave. The curse is anchored here. Alien stepped forward and placed the borrow stone atop the tomb. At once the air split with a howl, not heard but felt, as though their very bones trembled with the scream. The stone blazed bright and sank into the obsidian, vanishing without a trace. Then silence. Belarus stepped closer, her hand reaching for the channel we need to burn. The hearthstone within it lies beneath the tomb, buried in oil and salt. As she reached down, a ripple passed across the water, and a figure rose from the stone. It was Arzul, not the shadow from the throne above, but his likeness from the vision, flesh and blood, robes billowing as if caught in some unfelt wind, crowned and smiling. You bring me what was lost, he said, voice smooth and deep, and you would destroy it. How ungrateful. Halion, raise the sword, you're dead. I was, Alzul said, but your presence gives me form again. The blood of Westerines has ever been rich with fire, it feeds me. Milera threw a vial of oil at the tomb and shouted in the old tongue. The flames caught, but Azul raised a hand, and the fire twisted into a spiral of smoke. You would burn my soul, he hissed, then I shall burn yours first. With a cry, the shadows around the sarcophagi stirred. The dead began to rise alone, lunged forward, sword flashing in the strange light. The blade struck the specter, but passed through him as though through mist. Alzul's laugh echoed through the chamber. You cannot kill what is not truly alive, but I can unmake what you are. Suddenly Valera darted past him and plunged her knife into the glowing channel. The runes flared white as all screamed, not in pain, but in fury. The tomb cracked, and a rush of black vapor burst forth. Halion grabbed Valera's arm and dragged her back as the chamber began to collapse. We've weakened him, she gasped, but he's not gone, not yet. As they ran back through the shattering halls, Halion realized the truth. This had not been the final vault. It had been only the first, and Azul was. Waking up the tunnel, behind them cracked and groaned like a tree about to split. Stones clattered from the ceiling as Halian and Varys stumbled back through the corridor, their breath loud in the echoing dark dust choked the air. The path that had been narrow before now seemed to close in on them with every heartbeat, as if the vault itself were folding inward, determined to bury its secrets with them. Buster, Vila recalled, though she was already moving as swiftly as the cramped space allowed. The glow from her lantern flickered and hissed, casting their shadows against the jagged stone in monstrous shapes. Halian's sword scraped the walls more than once, but he kept it drawn, unwilling to be caught defenseless again. They reached the circular chamber at last, but it too had changed. One of the statues had fallen. The others had turned, not physically, but subtly, as if their heads now watched the archway instead of the center of the water. In the silver pool boiled quietly, though no heat rose from it, and the rooms around the archway pulsed with a dull red light that hadn't been there before. Barrera slowed, eyes scanning the room. Something's wrong. The power we disturbed has bled through the upper chambers. Alien stepped beside her, breathing hard. The vault, it was never meant to be sealed forever, was it? No, she replied, her voice tight with dread. It was meant to contain his spirit until the rightful heir could come and destroy the hearthstone we burned the surface of it, but we didn't destroy the core. He still tethered the archway, hum behind them. Halen turned to it, frowning. It no longer looked like a mere relic. Through its black stone frame shimmered a strange, shifting image. Mountains beneath, storm clouds, distant towers, long lost to time. It was a portal, he realized, and what it showed was no place he had ever seen. Where does it lead? He asked. Veeler did not answer at once. She stepped closer to the pool and looked into its depths, then slowly shook her head. Not to any place in our world. I think it's his memory, the last echo of his living realm. Halian's thoughts raced. If Arzul's curse had begun in that ancient time before he fell entirely under Sauron's power, then perhaps something had been left behind in the forgotten kingdom, something that might still be undone. He looked to Valera, who met his gaze grimly. You want to go through? She said. If there's a way to end this, truly end it, then we have to find it. He replied, we've already gone farther than anyone in living memory. Her eyes softened slightly. Then we go together, but we must be swift. The longer we remain in that place, the more he will know. They stepped through the arch together. The sensation was not like walking through a door. It was like falling into a dream where the world had no weight. Colors blurred, the sound of stone and flame rushed past them. And then, without warning, they were standing on a wide road of obsidian beneath a blood-cold sky. Before them rose a city. It was unlike Minas Tirith or Ostjalath. This was a fortress built for awe and fear. Its towers were narrow and high-spiked, like thorns. Black banners hung from battlements, though no wind stirred them. The air was thick and still. At the center of the city stood a citadel crowned with a burning brazier, its flames giving no light, only shadow. This was a seat, Valera whispered, Duma Erat, in the years before the world changed. There were no people, no soldiers, only silence and the strange sense that they were not alone. Halian led them along the wide road toward the gates. As they approached, the stones beneath their boots began to shimmer, faintly revealing ghostly impressions. Figures marching in silence, heads bowed, as if trapped in some long-forgotten memory. None looked up, none spoke. The gates stood open as if waiting inside the city was filled with ruins that were. Not ruined buildings stood tall, unmarred by time, yet every window was dark, every door closed at the corners of the main square stood tall, braziers each filled with black fire that crackled without sound. Helen felt the pull of the central tower like a thread wrapped tight around his heart. We must go to the top, Valera, said the flame. There burns his will. If we quench it, we may loosen his hold on the world. They crossed the square, their steps the only sound as they neared the citadel. A low moan drifted from the shadows. At first Helene thought it was the wind, until it rose into a wordless chant, deep, low, and filled with despair. He looked around from every side street, from every alley. Figures emerged. They were men, or had once been pale and hollowy, dressed in the robes of scribes and priests. Their hands bled ink, and their mouths moved as if reciting endless lines of forgotten scripture. They did not block the way, but watched with empty gazes, their chant rising as Helene and Era climbed the steps to the tower. The door to the citadel was carved with runes that bled crimson light. Halion pushed it open, and they stepped into a hall of mirrors. No wall was plain. Every surface was glass polished and cold, reflecting not themselves, but other images. Halilon saw his mother's face, his brother's death, his own failures. Valara's eyes went wide as she glimpsed scenes of war. Her father's face turned to ash in a desert temple burning beneath a dark sun. Don't look at them, she muttered. They feed on fear. They climbed the stair, wound tightly through the tower, rising higher and higher, until at last they reached the brazier chamber. It was vast, open to the red sky, and in its center stood a flame the color of shadow. Around it were 9 black pillars, each one marked with the sigil of a nasal. He drew his power from them. Belera said even before Sauron's gift he stole magic from the other kings. This place, it's his theft made manifest. Halilon stepped toward the flame, but it flared suddenly, and a voice spoke, not like the echo from the tomb, but clear and full, like a man standing at his side. You come to steal from me, it said, and from the flame stepped a man-shaped figure taller than any mortal. His robes were black and gold, and upon his head sat the broken crown. His face was not rotted or hidden, it was young, noble, and cold. You would take what I preserved. You preserved a curse, Helene said, raising his sword. You bound your soul to a dying land. I'll lend it, you cannot. The figure said, not in fury, but certainty. You stand within me, I am memory, I am oath, and you are mine. The flame, surged. Valera cried out as it pulled at her, dragging her toward the center. Halion grabbed her hand, held fast, and shouted words he had only ever heard in old songs, the battle speech of the number Minorans. The flame faltered. He reached into his cloak and drew out the sigil of command, the token he had worn since his first posting, the symbol of Gundor's watch on the border. With a cry, he hurled it into the black fire. The flames screamed, the crown cracked, and the city trembled as the illusion began to fall apart. Run, Valero shouted, the veil is breaking. And they turned and fled, the citadel shattering around them. The red sky peeled back, the sound of shattering mirrors echoed like thunder. and then darkness when Helen opened his eyes the first. Thing he saw was stone gray, cracked, and lifeless it pressed close to his face. Cold against his skin, his limbs act as though he had been flung through ice and fire in the same breath, and for a long moment he could not remember where he was or how he had come there. Then the memory returned to flame the citadel. The broken crown and Ar's cry as the veil shattered around them. He groaned softly and tried to sit up. They were no longer in the dream world. That much was clear. The sky above him was black, but it was a true darkness, now not the oppressive crimson twilight of the ghost city. Stars glimmered faintly through a broken stone ceiling, and a chill wind stirred the dust around him. He was lying at the edge of the silver pool in the circular chamber, the one with the archway and the statues, but something was wrong. The archway was cracked down the center, its runes dim and lifeless. The pool was dry, and of the 7 statues that once stood around the room, only 3 remained intact. The rest had crumbled into heaps of shattered stone. Valera, Hellion called out, his voice for a moment passed before a shape stirred near the wall. She sat against a fallen pillar, rubbing her head, her cloak torn and dust-streaked, but she was alive when she looked at him. Relief lit her face, quickly followed by weariness. "You threw the sigil," she said, "your badge of command." "Why? It was all I had," he replied, pushing himself to his feet. "He wanted to bind me to that place. That symbol held power, not just of Gundor, but of my name. I gave it up to break his grip." She nodded slowly. "You were right. The veil has been torn. We force him back." Alien looked around the broken chamber. "Then it's done." Rella hesitated. "No, we broke the gate. He used to reach us. But we haven't destroyed the Heartstone. Not entirely. His essence still clings to the world. Lesser now, scattered but not dead." There was a deep rumble from below, so faint it might have been imagined. High turned toward the stair they had first descended. A soft green light flickered from deep beneath. "I thought we sealed the tomb," he said. "We did," Valera replied grimly, "but not the one that lies beneath it." Was she stood slowly, dusting herself off. The vault above was built after Arzul's fall, a warding place crafted by his own priests when they realized the horror they had helped create. But it was only a covering stone. The true tomb, where he hid the final piece of the Heartstone, lies below, far deeper buried in the earth. It can't be reached by magic or by force alone, only by walking. Halien's jaw tightened. He had thought the nightmare near its end, but the path still stretched ahead of them, and yet some part of him had known it would not be so easy. "Then we go," he said before he finds another gate. The descent took them into older stone. The stairs wound tighter now, the ceiling lower, and the very air began to hum with a faint sickly heat. The walls were no longer carved but grown. Twisted veins of black crystals snaked through the stone like roots, pulsing faintly, casting strange shadows. No runes guided them here. No lamps lit their path. Only the dull throb of the hearthstones echoed, drew them deeper. At one point they passed through a narrow gallery filled with hanging chains. Some were broken, others still bore fragments of bone, and Vela uttered a prayer beneath her breath as they walked. This had once been a place of punishment, Halion realized, not for enemies, but for servants, those who had failed their cursed king and been left here to die. Far below they reached a chamber, not carved by any hand, but shaped by the earth itself, a cavern vast and domed. Its Floor uneven and broken by jagged stone, in the center stood an altar of black glass, and upon it rested the final piece of the hearthstone, larger than before, shard as long as a man's arm, glowing with a fierce inner light. It pulsed like a beating heart. Valari stopped at the threshold. This is it. As they stepped closer, a sudden wind rose, though no opening admitted it, and the shadows gathered into form. Azul's voice echoed once more, but it was weaker now, thin and sharp like a blade drawn across stone. You dare return, you who are nothing, you who would end a king alien, raised his sword. You were never a king, only a thief, who called himself one thief. The voice sneered, I created power before Sauron. Before the Nine, I bound my name to stone, to fire, to the breath of the world. I am not ended, I am eternal. The altar flared black, mist rose and took shape tall, skeletal, wearing no crown, now only a twisted helm of smoke, the specter of Arzul stretched both arms, and from the shadows around them rose figures cloaked in bone-white robes. These were his priests long dead, but summoned by his will. Belera drew her knife, and the two stood back to back as the dead closed in. We have to shatter the heart stone, she called. It's the last anchor, but only the fire of a living soul can break it. Halien's eyes flicked to the glowing crystal. His sword would not be enough. Steel had no power over such magic. He fought off a charging wraith, knocking its blade aside, and turned to Velra. What did you mean, the fire of a living soul? She blocked another strike. It must be someone who chooses to give up everything memory power. Name someone who burns their whole self into the stone to break it high. Felt the word strike deep. The choice was plain. Patsu laughed again. You cannot destroy me without destroying yourself. You would vanish, no glory, no song, only silence. I don't need a song, Halien muttered with sudden speed. He leapt to the altar. Howell shouted, reaching for him, but he was already there. He pressed both hands to the stone. Heat surged through him, blinding, unbearable, but he held fast. He thought of his fallen men, of Gundor's banner, high upon the hill, of the watchmen who would come after him. He thought of peace, and he let go. The light from the stone exploded outward in a wave. The specters screamed. The altar cracked from end to end. The cavern shook, and the voice of Azul shrieked. Once then fell silent when the light faded. Halen was gone. Vara stood alone beside the smoking altar. The crystal shattered into dust. The black veins in the stone had gone dark. The echo of the curse had ended. She knelt, closed her eyes, and whispered a name to the silence. Then she rose and began the long walk back to the world above. The climb back through the shattered vault felt longer than the journey down. The once dark walls no longer pulsed with Azul's sick magic, yet a hush lingered in the stone, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Far moved carefully her lantern, throwing long shadows up the crumbling steps. She had bound her arm where the wraith's blade had grazed her. Though it had not drawn blood, it had left a burn that throbbed with every heartbeat. She ignored the pain. There was only one task that remained now, to bring Halien's story back to the light. When she reached the circular chamber, she paused. The archway lay in ruins. Its great stones tumbled to the floor like a broken jaw. The silver pool was dry and cracked, and the shattered statues looked more like mourners than guardians, but it was quiet, the kind of silence that came only after great sorrow. or great victory Valera crossed to the remnants of the pool and knelt beside it. She drew out the eye of Nerrig from the folds of her cloak and placed it gently in the basin. It no longer glowed, and its once shifting surface had grown dull like glass cooled after fire whatever visions it had once granted were gone, now burned away by the shattering of the curse yet. She left it there anyway. Some relics were not meant to be carried any longer. By the time she emerged from the deep vault into the morning light, the sun was cresting the eastern horizon, painting the land in a pale golden wash. The wind stirred the grass of the vale of dusk, brushing the broken stones with soft, whispering fingers. The silence here felt different, peaceful. Not heavy. The curse had lifted. The path back to Gundor was long, and Valera did not travel in haste. She stopped, often resting beneath old trees or at the edges of forgotten streams. Her thoughts were heavy with all she had seen and all she had lost, yet there was also a strange lightness within her. Halien's sacrifice had not been in vain. A week later, she reached the border outpost where Halen had first received his orders. The garrison's stone walls stood firm against the plain, its banners fluttering gently in the wind. When she arrived at the gate, 2 guards stepped forward, their spears crossing in instinctive caution. But when they saw the sigil Helene had entrusted to her before entering the vault, a ring engraved with the symbol of Gundor, they lowered their weapons and opened the gate. The commander was a broad-shouldered man with streaks of gray in his beard and weary eyes that missed little. He listened silently as Era told her tale. She did not embellish it. She spoke of the vanishing of Halien's company, of the vault and the borrow stone of Azul's broken crown, and the dream city beyond the archway. And finally she told of Halien's final act. When she finished, the commander rose from his seat and walked to the window. For a long time he said nothing, then he turned back to her. There are few in this age who still speak the name of the Nine, he said, even fewer who believe they left behind more than empty ruins. But I believe you. He paused, then added more quietly, and I will make certain others do as well. That evening a fire was lit upon the hill behind the garrison, not for mourning, but for remembrance. Men gathered and sang the watchman's song, an old marching tune of Gundor, seldom used, but always ready. When honor called, did not join the singing. She sat at the edge of the firelight, listening, her face unreadable. The next morning she slipped away at dawn before the others stirred. She left no message, no sign of her path, only a small token at the base of the firewood pile, a stone carved with a broken crown. And below, at the symbol of Halien's family, a hawk in flight. Seasons passed. The veil of dusk grew quieter still, and in time grass crept over the shattered stones. Travelers once more crossed the eastern roads, unaware of what had stirred beneath them. Yet sometimes when the wind rose from the hills, it carried a faint song, a man's voice, clear and strong, singing in a tongue older than Gondan. Deep below the mountain, in the place where the last of the hearthstone had turned to ash, no whisper stirred. The shadow that had once been Azul, the 3rd Nazgûl, was gone at last, not banished. Noril, but ended. The wind over the plains of Rune was different now, where once it had carried the faint cry of unseen things and the choking scent of old earth. It now whispered only across wild grasses and forgotten stones, yet far to the north of the veil of dusk, where the Land began to rise, and low rolling hills there stood a place still untouched by time or memory, a ruined watchtower perched upon a jagged bluff surrounded by thorns and stunted trees. The folk of nearby villages avoided it without knowing why they claimed it was cursed, though few remembered what curse had ever lain there. In the shadow of that tower a lone rider arrived at twilight. He was wrapped in a hooded cloak of deep green, and his horse was lean and dust-covered from many miles he rode without heraldry, and carried no standard, but his bearing spoke of purpose. At the base of the hill he dismounted and walked the path to the tower on foot, leaving the mayor to graze in the tall grass inside the tower. Nothing remained but shattered flagstones and ivy-covered walls. The ceiling had long since collapsed, and the air smelled of stone and rain, yet the rider walked straight to the center of the ruin and knelt, brushing aside old leaves and dust until he found the remains of a mosaic beneath a faded crest worked in colored stone. A hawk in flight, its wings outstretched above a line of broken crowns. He stared at it for a long time. Then he drew from his cloak a bundle wrapped in dark cloth and laid it reverently on the ground. From it he revealed a sword not ancient, but finely forged with a grip of ashwood wrapped in black leather, and a silver pommel engraved with a single rune. Hally, the rider, remained kneeling, one hand resting on the hilt until the stars began to shine above the broken tower. Then he stood, left the sword resting across the mosaic, and turned away, dilutely none. He did not look back, and minus TTH the white city gleamed brighter than it had. In an age the towers of the citadel were silver against the sky, and the flags of the realm snapped smartly in the breeze. It was spring, and with it had come the return of the king's court from its winter retreat in dull Amroth merchants crowded the lower circles, and children ran laughing along the city's winding streets. But in the house of Eltucht, between two garden terraces and lined with scrolls and tomes older than the walls themselves, a different kind of gathering took place. 3 figures stood around a great oak table studying an open scroll marked with faded ink and ancient script. One was a wise lawmaster in pale robes, his hands stained with ink, and his beard neatly braided in the old Gondorian style. The second was a young scribe, barely of age, who listened wide-eyed and silent. The third was a woman in a dark cloak with a copper circlet upon her brow, her eyes sharp, her voice quiet. Valera had not planned to return to Mainz, but word of what she had witnessed in the east had found its way west, riding ahead of her like the shadow of a storm. She had resisted at first, content to vanish into the roads and the wild places, but when the invitation came from the king's steward himself, sealed with a white tree, she knew she could not refuse. Now she stood beneath the ancient dome, listening as the lawmaster read aloud a passage from the book of Lost Kings of the Third. It is said he ruled a land of fire and shadow, and took no bride, but power. He was the first of the 9 to bow, and the last to fall, yet his name was struck from the annals for to speak. It was to wake it, and to wake it was to fall. He looked up from the scroll, eyes narrowing slightly, and yet you claim he returned. Ari's reply was quiet but steady. He never left. The lawmaster studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. There are few who still study, the 9 fewer still who believe their spirits can linger. But if your tale is true, it is, she said more sharply than she intended. I saw the curse take men. I trusted I saw what lay beneath the veil. I saw Halion. Fall the old man inclined his head. Then Gondar owes him more than thanks we owe. Him a name among the heroes of this age. Beller hesitated. He never asked for one. That is why he earned it when she left the house of Law the sun had begun to. Set behind Mount Meandwan, casting long shadows over the city Valera walked. Through the citadel gardens past the old fountains and marble benches until she came to a balcony that overlooked the Pelennor fields. The air smelled of olive trees and fresh-cut grass far in the distance beyond the Anjou in the land rose gently toward the east, the direction she had come from. She stood there for a long time, watching the wind move across the plain that night as the moon climbed high and silver above the city. The stewards of Gondor entered the tomb hall beneath the citadel there. Beneath the stone vaults carved with the names of heroes, they placed a new marker. It was a simple one, no gilded lettering or fine marble, but it bore the sign of the hawk in flight, and beneath it carved with a craftsman's careful hand were the words Palion, captain of the Eastern Watch, who stood when all others fell, who chose silence over song, whose name will not be forgotten. Beyond the borders of Gondor the tale spread slowly. It was told first by soldiers and scouts, then by wanderers, then by minstrels who changed some names and added others until it passed into story children. Whispered it on cold nights, farmers carved the hawk sign into barn doors. Without knowing why, and in rune where the shadows had lingered longest, the land began to bloom again, for the curse had truly lifted, but deep in some corners of the world there were still ruins where no birds sang, and hollows in the mountains where the stone held a memory of something darker, and in those places, though Arzel's name was broken, the echo of his pride remained a warning carved not in stone, but in silence. And Askel were gone, but the choices that made them, that hunger for power, that thirst for deathless rule, those would always remain, and so would those who chose to stand against them in the far reaches of eastern Gondor, where the rivers narrow and the roads turn to dirt. There lies a village known as Barathan. It is not marked on most maps, nor does it boast towers or walls. The houses are simple, built of stone and timber, and people live by the rhythm of the land. They tend their fields, mend their boats, and keep to the old customs, though much of the world has forgotten them. It was in Barathan, nearly a year after the fall of Azul's curse, that a stranger arrived. In the early days of autumn he came on foot, cloaked in a robe of faded blue, his hair strewn with gray, and his beard trimmed short. He spoke with the tone of one who had once commanded men, but now sought only quiet. He gave no name when asked. He simply said he was a traveler, for minister seeking a quieter life. The villagers, curious but kind, offered him work. He mended nets, helped repair roofs, and spent long hours speaking with the children, teaching them tales of kings and distant lands. In time they came to call him Master Tan, and he did not correct them. No one guessed, not truly, who he was. For in truth he was not Halion, not as he had been the moment he had placed his hands on the hearthstone and let himself go. Something had changed his body, had broken, yes, and the flame had taken his name and history with it, but some spark had been preserved, some fragment of his soul unburned. The flame meant to destroy him had instead scattered him across the veil between worlds. And when the gate shattered and the curse ended. That spark had found a path back. He had not awoken in the tomb, nor in the lands beyond death. He had awoken far to the north, beneath a fallen tree beside a quiet stream, with no memory of his name only. Dreamed shards of battle, and flamed the echo of a woman's voice in a city of glass that cracked underfoot weeks. He wandered half-mad with fever until a healer's caravan found him and took him, and he healed slowly, and as he did, pieces of his memory returned, not as facts, but as instincts. He could speak the old tongue of Numer. He remembered the weight of a sword in his hand. He could sense evil long before it was seen, but the name Halion did not return, nor did he seek it. In Barathan, he found a peace he had never known. There were no garrisons here, no banners or duties. The land was untouched by war, and the people were content with the simple joys of life. He built a small house at the edge of the village close to the river and grew herbs in a patch of sunlit soil. The children called him wise, and the elders respected his quiet strength. Yet at night, when the wind rose through the trees and the stars turned overhead, he sometimes stood at the water's edge and gazed eastward. Something within him stirred, then a longing not for battle or glory, but for understanding, as though part of him waited still far beneath the mountain beside a shattered stone. Valera, meanwhile, had not remained in Minister Tirth, though the court had honored her and offered her a place among the Queen's Council of Law. She had refused it. Her heart was not for stone halls and parchment. It beat for the open road, for wind and wild hills, and for the unanswered questions that still lingered in the corners of the world. The death of Azul had lifted a shadow, yes, but it had also opened a door, one that led deeper into the forgotten history of Middle. She traveled east beyond the veil, to places few dared speak of. She searched the ruins of old runish temples and climbed broken stairways lost to moss and time. She spoke with wandering tribes who remembered the old days through chants and tattoos, and she listened more than she spoke. From one of them, a blind woman who sang to stones. Valera learned that our soul had not been the first to seek deathlessness through binding his name to earth. Long before the rings of power, there had been others, men and women, who had tried to bend the world to their will through song, blood, and memory. Their names have been lost, but their works remain buried, scattered, sleeping. She sent scrolls back to Minister Tith, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with her mark. The law masters received them in silence, and some said that a new library was being prepared in the Sixth Circle, one devoted not to the glories of kings, but to the dangers of forgotten power. Valera's name, too, began to pass into legend, not as a warrior or queen, but as a seeker, the watcher of the East. Some called her the voice of the forgotten, and though she had no title and wore no crown, her word was trusted from Belals to the Sea of Rune. Yet for all her travels, she never returned to Barathan. Whether she knew of the man who lived there, no one could say. Perhaps she guessed, or perhaps she had made her peace with what had passed between them, but she did not return one winter evening. As snow fell lightly over the village fields and the river froze at the edges, Master Talon sat alone beside his hearth. He had carved a wooden hawk and set it above the mantel, a gift for the village's newest child born. Just a few days before, the fire crackled gently, and outside the wind stirred the trees. He held a mug of tea between his hands and stared into the flames. For a moment his mind wandered he saw. Again the great throne of stone, the hooded wraith, the fire that burned without warmth, he saw Valara's hand, reaching for his, and he heard a name not spoken aloud, but breathed in the silence, alien. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the fire had settled, and the world was still. He smiled faintly, took a sip of tea, and leaned back in his chair. There was peace now, and if his name had been lost in the fire, he did not mourn it, for he had chosen silence, and that too was a kind of song. Spring returned to Barathon with a hush of green across the fields and the quiet murmur of snow melt in the streams. The orchards began to blossom, and the village paths, once muddy with winter, rain grew firm beneath the sun. For most, it was a season like any other, marked by planting and shearing and the familiar rhythm of life. But from master to lone, the season stirred something different. The dreams had come again. They were not nightmares, not in the usual sense. He did not wake in fear or dread, but each morning he remembered pieces that had not been there before. A name spoken in a language he could not place, a tower glimpsed through mist, a woman with ashed dark hair standing on the edge of a broken battlefield. Her face was never quite clear, yet it never felt unfamiliar, and though he told no one in the village, he knew what it meant. The past, though buried, was not gone. One morning, just before sunrise, he rose and walked to the edge of the river. The sky above was pale with the promise of dawn, and mist drifted low across the water. He stood there a long time, watching the current move. His cloak gathered around him. Against the chill, his hand rested absently on the hilt of the knife at his belt, not a weapon of war, but a blade, shaped for utility, worn smooth by years of use. Behind him, the door of the healer's house creaked open, and a boy came running across the grass barefoot and still half asleep. Master Talon. The boy called breathlessly, "There's someone here, someone from the city." Talon turned, brows raised from mine as Tiff. The boy nodded. "She's at the inn," she asked. "For you by name?" The words sent a jolt through him, though he did not yet understand why. He thanked the boy and made his way into the village square, where the inn's shutters had just been opened to let in the morning light. A rider's horse stood tied outside, dust-streaked and weary. From a long road within, the innkeeper was already setting bread on the tables and lighting the fire for breakfast, and near the hearth, wrapped in a long travel cloak and sipping something warm from a clay mug, sat a woman with a copper circlet on her brow. Bella looked up as he entered. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her expression was unreadable, neither surprise nor certainty, but something in between. She set down her mug and rose her gaze. "Steady. I wasn't sure you would still be here," she said quietly, "and I wasn't sure you would come at all," he replied. The innkeeper, sensing the weight of the moment, retreated politely to the kitchen, leaving them alone. Vel across the room, with a measured pace. "I searched for you," she said, not in the beginning. "I thought you were gone, but later, when the dreams came, when I found your blade in the tower ruins near the ash hills, I knew. I don't remember everything," Talan admitted, "not the way I should. Faces, names, feelings, they come in flashes, but never all at once, they don't." Nita, she said, "You came back, that's enough." They sat together near the hearth, and she told him of the lands beyond ruin, of the buried shrines, and the fading memories of the nine she spoke of, the Black Archive being founded in Mainz, and of the young scribes who now learned the names that had once been forbidden to speak. The tale of Azul had become more than a secret. It had become A warning carefully recorded and passed on in you? She asked at last, looking at him across the fire. What have you found here? He paused, thinking not peace. Exactly, but something close to it. The people here don't know me not truly, and they don't ask that used to trouble me now. I think it's a gift. She nodded. Slowly, I think you've earned it. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound, the crackle of the fire and the distant chatter of birds outside the window. Bella reached into her cloak and drew out a folded piece of parchment aged and sealed with wax. I brought something, she said, from the steward of Gundor. It's not a command, only a letter. Talon took it, breaking the seal. With careful fingers, the script was familiar, formal, but kind. To Halion, if he yet walks the world, your name was written in the halls of memory, not to bind you, but to honor you. If you choose never to return, you shall still be remembered. But if one day you wish to walk once more beneath the banners of your people, know that your place remains. The Eastern Watch waits for no man yet. It remembers its heroes go in peace or return in strength. The choice is yours. Aragon, steward of the White Tower, he read it twice, then folded it again, and placed it beside the half. I don't know if I'll answer, he said softly. You don't have to. Vela replied, some stories are finished before the last word is written. She stayed in the village that night. They spoke little more, but the silence between them was no longer heavy with things unsaid. In the morning she rode eastward back into the world of wind and road and shadowed stone, and Talon returned to the riverbank where the trees whispered in the breeze and the mist rose like smoke from the water. He looked out across the hills and thought of towers and fire, of shattered crowns and quiet strength. He did not know if he would ever walk again beneath Gundor's banner, but he knew one truth as clear as the sunlight on the river. His name had not been taken, it had been given, and whether he chose to carry it or leave it behind, it would remain not in song, but in memory, and sometimes that was enough. A month passed in Barathan, and with it came the long days of planting and the scent of apple blossoms drifting on the wind. The villagers went about their work with the steady rhythm of those who had never known great wars or mighty kings, and though Master Talon remained a quiet presence among them, there was an ease to his movements now, as though some knot within him had finally loosened. The letter from the steward remained by his hearth untouched, but not forgotten, and every so often he would glance at it, as though expecting the parchment to whisper a choice aloud. It was on a rainless afternoon, just as the sky had turned the soft color of faded parchment, that a second rider came to the village. Unlike Valaire's quiet arrival, this one caused a stir. The rider wore a uniform, not the silver and black of minister, but the green and gold of Ethelion marked with the sigil of a white bow. He was young, clean-shaven, and bore the proud posture of a scout recently raised to command. His name was Kalen, and his horse was lathered with sweat. When he reached the square, he called for water and food, and after speaking with the innkeeper and being pointed toward the riverbank, he found Master Talon sitting on a flat stone beneath a willow tree, mending a fishing net. Are you the one they call Talon? Kalen asked, lowering his hood. I am, came the calm reply, though the man's hands never stopped their work. The rider hesitated, as though searching for the right words. Then I bring a message for you, sir. There's trouble in the south, nothing like the great wars, but strange enough. To send word north, villages near the crossings of Poros have begun to vanish, entire settlements gone without a trace. The scouts say the land feels wrong still, and hollow some speak of a black. Missed others of lights moving in the night. Talon looked up at last. And you believe this is connected to the Nine? I don't know what to believe, Kalen admitted, but the steward sent me with. Wanted her find the Watcher. If he lives, tell him Gondar may need him again. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Talon tied off the last knot in the net, then stood brushing his hands clean on his tunic. I am no longer the Watcher, he said slowly. That name was left behind in a place that burned. The young man nodded. Respectfully, even so, sir, you are remembered, and not only by Minas. The runic tribes whisper your story. The desert folk tell it by firelight. You may wish to forget, but the world does not. Talon turned to look at the river where the water ran smooth and quiet beneath the fading light. In the distance, a pair of children laughed as they raced along the path, and a farmer called to his oxen. The village was as it had always been, untouched by power, safe in its silence. But beyond the river, beyond the hills, lay a world that never truly slept. He faced Callan once more. Give me until dawn. That night he did not sleep. Instead, he packed his satchel with quiet precision, placing each item as if performing a ritual. The small carving of the hawk he left on the mantel facing the hearth. The steward's letter he folded once more and slid into the satchel. He took the knife he had used each day since coming to Barathon, sharpening it until it gleamed. But most of all, he retrieved the sword he had buried beneath the floor, wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in cedar. When he unwrapped it, the blade had not dulled. Its runes still shone faintly in the firelight, and the weight of it in his hand felt both foreign and familiar-like. Eyes were shut, and its hands were clasped before it, yet the air around it shimmered with a pressure that made it hard to breathe as they stepped forward. Its eyes open, they were not eyes at all, but pits of burning light, red as coals. You come to stop what has already begun, it said, its voice neither male nor female, but something cold and deep like water flowing over stone. You carry the echo of one who broke the chain. Talon took a single step closer, sword in hand. Who are you? I am what came before the Nazgûl, before the ring's eye. Am a voice that whispered in the ears of kings. I am the memory Azul tried to copy, but he was only shadow. I am root behind them. The chamber began to tremble. Kalen drew an arrow, but the figure did not move. You will not stop the awakening, it said, for I do not sleep. I wait. Then the light flared and the walls cried out. With voices that had no mouths, Tulin raised his sword, and the chamber shattered. The light engulfed them before they could move. It came not in a single burst, but in a slow rising swell that swallowed the chamber like a tide. Tulin tried to shield his eyes, but the brilliance was not merely a thing seen. It was something felt, a pressure that forced itself behind the eyes and into the chest, crowding the heart with heat and a sensation that hovered somewhere between memory and fear. Kalen cried out beside him, but the sound was torn away by a great wind that screamed through the chamber without stirring so much as a lock of hair. When the light at last faded, the Colossus was gone, or perhaps it had never truly stood, for they were no longer in the chamber. They had entered. The walls were the same shape, the floor the same stone, but now the air shimmered with a reddish hue, and the markings along the floor glowed faintly like embers beneath, Ash the figure on the dais still stood. Unchanged, unmoved, but now it looked down on them with a curious tilt of its head. "You see now," it said, its voice as quiet as falling Ash the Nine were not. Born of Sauron's power alone, they were shaped by a design older and deeper one, whose root was buried in the souls of men long before rings were forged. Talon's grip on his sword tightened. "You're trying to rise through his fall," he said, "through Azul, through the echo of his curse." "I do not rise," the figure replied. "I return." The flame that bound Arzul's soul was not of his own making. He found it, touched it, tried to master it. But his will was small, his curse, his pride, his fall. They were only shadows of what was meant to be. Alan stepped forward, keeping his arrow notched. "What is this place?" The figure turned its gaze on him, and Ken staggered as if struck, though the being had not moved. "This is not a place," it said. "It is a wound in the world, a scar left when the first oath was broken. Before kingdoms, before crowns." Talon's voice cut through the rising hum that now throbbed through the chamber. "You said I carry an echo. What do you mean?" The figure looked back to him, and for a heartbeat its face changed, not with malice nor cruelty, but with something colder still, recognition. "You bear the ash of sacrifice. You burned yourself to end the curse. That fire touched the deeper flame it marked you. And now you bring me its memory." Talon's mind reeled. He had thought the curse ended. He had walked away from death, left his name in silence, and lived as a man of peace. But now he saw that in destroying Alzul's anchor, he had opened something older, a path that had been sealed until one bold enough to break it came along, not by intention, but by design. The humming grew louder along the walls. The veins of red crystal pulsed faster. The stone beneath their feet began to warm. "We need to get out," Kalen said, his voice tense now. But the figure did not move. Its form wavered slightly, as if flickering between substance and smoke. "You may go," it said this time, "but you cannot stop what is already awakened." "What have I awakened?" Talon asked, though he feared the answer. The figure's eyes burned brighter. "The memory of power without purpose, the oldest hunger." And then it vanished. The chamber darkened in an instant. The warmth fled. The humming ceased. The air became still once more, and the veins of crystal faded to dull gray. The only sound was the soft drip of water from somewhere deep within the stone. Talon turned to Kalen. "We leave now." They retraced their steps quickly, navigating the twisting corridors with little trouble, for the way was no longer hidden. Whatever force had cloaked the place before had gone silent. When they emerged once more into the valley, the sun was high, and the red light was gone from the sky, but in its place there was a mark high above the Colossus, though now it looked more like a ruined spire than a creature of stone. An emblem had burned itself into the air, faint as a watermark on parchment. A circle within a square, surrounded by a spiral of flame. Kalen stared at it. "I've never seen that before. It's not from Gundor, not from Rune, either." "No." Talon said quietly. "It's older than either." They rode north in silence, pressing hard across the hills. Villages that had been empty were still empty. No new signs of life returned, but the sense of stillness had lifted, replaced by something else, something watching, waiting, aware. When they reached the crossings again, Kalen sent a raven ahead to minister tith. He included a detailed sketch of the symbol and a short account of all they had seen. Talon wrote nothing, he sat by the river that evening, staring into the water as if expecting to find answers there. You burn the curse, Kalen said gently, but you also touched something old or something buried. I thought the world had moved on. Talon replied that the age of such threats was over, but perhaps the end of one story is always the seed of another. We've done all we could for now. Talon nodded. For now. He rose and looked east again toward the horizon beyond which lay lands, unnamed ruins, untouched, and stories yet untold. The fire within him, once quiet, had stirred again, not with wrath, but with resolve. They would return to minister. Turif, they would speak to the steward, and the next time the flame called, they would be ready. The walls of minister. Turf stood tall and white against the sky, gleaming in the morning sun, as if untouched by time, but as Talon and Kalen approached through the eastern gate, passing beneath the proud banners of the white tree, the city seemed somehow more solemn than he remembered. There were no crowds waiting at the entrance, no calls from watchmen asking their names. The guards knew Kalen, and by Kalen's word Talon was permitted through. Yet as they crossed into the lower circle and wound their way upward along the rising tiers of stone, he felt the weight of every step. Word had traveled ahead of them, carried by the raven. Kalen had sent from the crossings. The missive had reached the steward within days, and by the time Talon entered the tower of Ectelin, Baragond was already waiting. The steward had changed in the years since Talon had last seen him. His beard was strewn with grain now, and though his shoulders remained broad and his bearing noble, there was a gravity in his gaze that spoke of sleepless nights and burdens. Long he stood by the high window that overlooked the city, his hands clasped behind his back, and turned only when the door shut quietly behind Talia. Return, Baragond said. I didn't plan to. Talent replied, no, but you did. The steward motioned to the map table where several scrolls lay open. Among them was the sketch Kalen had drawn. The circle within the square, the spiral of flame. It looked older than it had any right to be, as though the ink had seeped into the parchment from a different age. We've searched every archive, Baragond said, tapping a finger lightly on the symbol from the annals of Numer to the dark records of Dol Guldur. No match, but there is one note in the gray annals, only a fragment. Really, it speaks of seal used in the eastern lands during the elder days, long before Sauron claimed Mordor. The translation is rough, but the meaning is clear enough. Talon weighted his hands, resting lightly on the back of the chair. The flame, without master, he let the words settle before he answered. It spoke to me not as Azul did, not with hunger or rage, but with knowledge. It didn't want to fight, it wanted to be seen. Beliger nodded slowly. The greatest danger lies not in the power we fight, but in the power we fail to understand. Sauron gave shape to evil, but he did not invent it. He learned it, borrowed it, and perhaps served it a silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft rustle of parchment and the distant cry of a hawk outside the tower. Then Baragond turned, his gaze sharp. We need to send an expedition, not just soldiers or scouts, scholars, translators, law masters, people who can listen as well as fight. You want me to lead it? Talent asked, though he already knew. The answer didn't hesitate. Yes, you've walked further into the dark than any man alive. You understand what's at stake, and you're not bound by name or rank anymore. That makes you the most dangerous man we have I'm not the man I was. Talon said, then you may be exactly who we need that night. He stood once more in the court of the white tree, its pale branches rising into the star-filled sky. The tree was still young, but had grown tall since the days of the Ring War, and its blossoms glowed faintly in the moonlight. Talon walked beneath its buffles and remembered the nights he had spent here long ago when he was a captain of the watch, dreaming of glory and honor, never knowing the price those dreams would carry. Beller found him there. She said nothing at first, simply stood beside him and watched the moon climb higher. Her hair was longer now, strewn with silver at the edges, but her eyes were just as bright. At her side hung the curved knife she had carried into the vault, still wrapped in the same dark leather. I heard she said at last about what you saw, the one who waits beneath the world, they call it the flame without master. Talon replied, but I don't think it has a name, not one. It gives. Valera folded her arms. And you're going back, they asked me to lead the expedition. I haven't said. Yes, you will. He looked at her. Would you come? She smiled faintly. You already know the answer to that. They stood together beneath the tree as the bells of the city chimed the hour. The light of the stars caught the edges of the tower. Above and far below, the streets of the city shone with quiet lamps. It was a peaceful sight, but Talon knew better than to trust peace when darkness was only waiting to take its shape. The expedition would not be small. Lawmasters from Rivendell were already being summoned. Riders from Dalamroth had been dispatched to the southern borders. Even the dwarves of Erebor had offered one of their stone seers to join the company, and whispers had reached the city that the elves of Lothlorien, though fewer than ever, had sent a message in silver script offering a guide of their own. Choosing Talon would not march at the head of an army. He would walk with those who remembered what had come before, and those who had not yet forgotten how to listen. Preparations began the following morning, and within 3 days the great court of the tower was filled with voices and footfalls. Couriers hurried between levels bearing sealed letters and supply lists, while smiths in the lower city worked day and night forging tools, repairing armor, and sharpening blades not meant for battle but for protection on paths unwalked for centuries. The city, which had lived quietly in peace for so many years, pulsed once more with purpose. Talon moved through it all with a sense of calm urgency. He had not accepted the leadership of the expedition out of pride or duty. Both of those had long since faded from his reasons. It was something else now, something quieter but no less powerful. The knowledge that unfinished things do not remain buried forever. If he did not go, someone else would, and they might not return by the 5th day. The company was assembled. There were 15 of them in all. Talon rode at the head, his sword now strapped across his back beneath a gray traveling cloak. Vila rode beside him, her knife at her side, her copper circlet replaced by a simple leather cord that tied back her hair. Kalen, ever watchful, led the vanguard of scouts, his bow strung and his eyes sharp. Beneath his hood from Rivendell came a Lanth, an elven scholar with pale hands and a voice like falling Lee. She carried no weapon, but the language of old things flowed from her lips like music, and her memory of forgotten runes made her indispensable. Beside her rode Duran of Erebor, a dwarf of quiet voice and sharp eyes, who had trained in the deep halls as a stone seer, one who listened to the language of earth. He said little, but When he placed his hand on stone, he heard things others could not. There was also a healer from Dol Amraph, a gay-bearded man named Mayan, who carried herbs in one pouch and salted meat in another, and who claimed to have once treated a king who did not wish to be cured. The company also included a brother and sister from the southern coast, twin blade fighters named LOTR and Da, who moved as one and spoke only to each other, unless pressed. Finally, two scribes from Minist rode at the rear, tasked with recording every finding, every name, every shape that had not been named. For an age they set out at dawn through the eastward gate. The people of the city did not cheer nor crowd the walls to see them off. This was no parade of banners or shining helms. It was quieter than that, and far more solemn. But as they passed the old stones, the watchman's song rose softly behind them, not shouted, but sung a low chant of honor and memory. Belera turned to Talon as they rode due. "You think this path ends the same way?" she asked with another flame. "Another choice, I don't know," he replied. "But this time we're not going alone." Their road took them once again across the Anjouan and south along the forgotten trails beyond the Poros. The villages were still empty, but no longer haunted. Whatever force had swallowed them had withdrawn, leaving only silence in its place. Yet as they pressed on into the low hills and hidden glens of the south, signs began to return, strange carvings in tree trunks, stones arranged in perfect circles without any sign of tools, and once a narrow cave mouth that glowed faintly when touched, though no light source could be found inside. Each evening they made camp beneath the stars, and the members of the company shared their knowledge. Islanth read poems from the days before days, written in a dialect that even the oldest law masters of Gondor struggled to understand. Durian sketched diagrams in the dirt, explaining how the earth cracked in patterns that echoed the shapes found in Alzol's broken temple. Velar spoke of dream songs she had heard whispered by desert tribes, songs of fire that had no name, but always listened. And Talon, though he rarely spoke, at length listened. He watched each piece come together, not like a puzzle, but like a warning. This was no single evil rising. It was something deeper, like a river swelling beneath the ground, waiting for the weight of time to break the soil above. On the 9th day, they reached the valley. It looked nothing like it had before. The spire was gone, collapsed perhaps, or vanished, but the earth was scorched in its place, and the stones around the valley's edge had sunk into the ground as though the land itself had drawn breath and then held it. At the center of the hollow stood anew shape a ring of pillars, each one different in height and make, carved from stone not found in any known region. They looked half melted and half carved, as though they had once been living. Talon dismounted and stepped forward, the rest of the company spreading out cautiously around him. "Do you recognize it?" Kaelin asked, scanning the horizon. "I've seen something like it," Talon said, but only in dream. Aaron approached one of the pillars. Placing his palm flat against it, he closed his eyes, muttered a few words in Khuzdul, and stepped back quickly. "It's not speaking," he said, "not in stone's tongue, it's waiting." Valera was already walking the ring, noting each symbol carved into the base of the pillars. "These aren't spells, they're invitations." "Invitations to what?" One of the scribes asked. "To listen," Elanth answered, quietly stepping into the circle. "To remember this place is older than any temple or fortress. It doesn't hold power, it holds memory." And as she spoke, the Wind shifted, the valley grew still, and then softly from beneath the earth itself a sound began to rise, not a voice, but something slower, deeper, like the echo of breath through stone. It did not frighten the company, but it held them. Still caught by the weight of it, the pillars began to shimmer, faintly not glowing but vibrating, as though they resonated with a sound no ear could fully catch. Talon stepped into the center of the ring, and then he saw it not with his eyes, but in his mind. Flashes of fire and halls beneath, the sea cities with no names, voices singing in harmony before the world was divided, and above it all a shape without form. Watching, listening, waiting, the same presence that had spoken in the Colossus. The flame without master, it was not evil to live with this guilt. It had no desire to destroy, but it did not care if its awakening broke the world, and he understood this was not a war to win, it was a choice to make. The valley held its breath, the humming deepened, though the air remained still, and the pillars surrounding the company thrummed with a rhythm that had no clear source. Each beat seemed to echo from the very bones of the world, not loud or sharp, but deep and unrelenting, like the heartbeat of something vast and ancient awakening. Beneath the skin of the land, Talon stood motionless at the center of the ring, his eyes fixed not on the stones, but on the space between them, where something unseen stirred. Just beyond the reach of light, the rest of the company remained outside the circle, watching in silence. Even Kalen, who had drawn his bow at the first sign of danger, now held it slack at his side, sensing that steel would serve no purpose here. Valera watched. Talon carefully, her eyes narrowed, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. Not to draw it, but to remember that she still held a weapon of her own then. Without warning, the center of the ring shifted, not visibly, not as though something had risen from the ground, but perceptibly, like a curtain being drawn from a mind. Talon felt it before he saw it. The